Welcome to the Ricci Flow Nutrition Podcast. My name is Cameron Borg. On this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Carey Gillam. Carey Gillam is an American investigative journalist, most prominently known for her work exposing the nefarious tactics employed by chemical agriculture companies. She has more than 30 years of experience covering food and agricultural policies and practices, including 17 years as a senior correspondent for Reuters International News Service. She has specialty knowledge about the health and environmental impacts of pervasive pesticide use and industrial agriculture, and has won several industry awards for her work. Her first book, Whitewash The Story of a Weed Killer, Cancer, and the Corruption of Science, was released in October 2017 and won the coveted Rachel Carson Book Award from the Society of Environmental Journalists, as well as 2 other awards. Gillam has been asked to speak all over the world about food and agricultural matters, including before the European Parliament in Brussels, the World Forum of Democracy in Strasbourg, and to public officials, organisations, and conferences in the US, Canada, Australia, Argentina, France, and the Netherlands. She has served as a consultant on and a participant in several documentary TV and film pieces, including the award-winning Poisoning Paradise documentary released in June 2019 by Pierce and Keely Brosnan. She also served as a story consultant and contributor to the 2022 documentary Into the Weeds by filmmaker Jennifer Beichwell. After leaving Reuters, Carey spent 6 years working as a reporter and data researcher for the public health investigative research group US Right to Know. She currently writes as a contributor for The Guardian and is managing editor of the New Lead, that's LEDE, a journalism initiative of the Environmental Working Group. It was an absolute privilege to speak with Carey, as her work is such an important step forward in the fight against the pervasive use of pesticides. She is one of the most important figures in this issue that we are all facing, and I strongly believe that we could all benefit from her work. With all that being said, I hope you enjoy the podcast. Carey, thank you so much for taking some time to speak with me today. I've been a huge fan of your work since I first read Whitewash several years ago. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
So when did you first get introduced to this idea that, glyphosate, this weed killer that was used worldwide, might be a problem?
So, it was a really long time ago. I was assigned by Reuters in 1998 to move to Kansas, actually, and start writing about agriculture and agricultural practices and these cool new genetically engineered seeds and crops that Monsanto had developed. And they GMO soy and corn and cotton, they were calling them RoundUp ready, because they were designed to be sprayed directly with RoundUp, this glyphosate-based herbicide. And farmers, it was supposed to be the coolest new thing ever, that farmers could spray their entire fields of crops directly over the top with RoundUp or glyphosate herbicide, and the crops would be great. The crops would be fine and would flourish, and the weeds would die. And this was changing agriculture in the United States and eventually around the world in many different countries. So it was my job by Reuters to really learn everything about that, spend a lot of time with farmers and scientists and with the company, Monsanto and others. And it just, led me down this path, I guess, over time, to find that what Monsanto and several industry players were telling us about how wonderful this chemical was, actually, that wasn't really true, and that there were a lot of problems, and both for human health and environmental health. And so it just led me down the rabbit hole, I guess, and led me to a place where I eventually wrote Whitewash, and then a second book about the litigation that has arisen around glyphosate. So it's been 20 some years,
Wow.
that I've been doing this, I guess.
So when you first started this project in 1998, when you started, working with the people in the industry and the farmers themselves, did you have any inkling that, something might be amiss, that there was, it sounded a little too good, or did you just think that this was going to be a standard sort of task for you?
Yeah, no, I really didn't. I didn't come at it skeptically, other than just the normal skepticism that comes with being a journalist.
Yep.
You don't really take everything, when a company is selling a product, of course, they're going to tell you how wonderful the product is, right? And that's just to be assumed. So I did what I've done when I covered the banking industry or the healthcare industry. You develop a lot of sources in different places. As I said, I spent a lot of time with farmers and learned what worked for them and what didn't, what were the benefits, what were the costs. I spent a lot of time learning about the science behind the technology, behind the chemical. And that science, as I was developing my knowledge base, the science was also developing, because when genetically engineered crops were introduced in the 1990s, glyphosate use then expanded because these crops were designed to be used with glyphosate very strategically by Monsanto. And so volume and use of Roundup chemicals, glyphosate, expanded just an insane amount. Glyphosate became the world's most widely used herbicide and used far more than competitors. And so the science developed around that, because as more and more people are being exposed and it's used more commonly, and we're finding residues, then scientists were finding that residues were in the food that we were eating and in the water we were drinking. And eventually even, so ubiquitous was the use that glyphosate residues are found in rainfall. So there was really a great effort in the scientific community worldwide to understand what this might mean for human health. Was it as safe as Monsanto said or not? And the science started to build in the late 1990s and the 2000s and through the 2000s up to where we are today, that no, it actually isn't as safe as table salt or safe enough to drink as was sort of the reputation that was developed around this chemical, that actually it's been tied to a whole array of cancers, non-Hodgkin lymphoma in particular, blood cancer, as well as reproductive problems, endocrine disrupting problems, liver and kidney. So there's been a lot of science develop around this that informed me and did bring me to a place where I feel that I have a very good understanding and some skepticism, clearly, at this point about what the industry says.
Yeah, and we're talking about Roundup, which is a mixture of a lot of different ingredients, but the primary one, the active ingredient called glyphosate. Can you tell us a little bit about, what is glyphosate and when was it first synthesized?
Yeah, so glyphosate has been around for a long time, and it went through various hands, in the 50s and 60s until the chemical companies were trying to find, a use for this molecule. After the wartime ended and we had these chemical companies that had been mostly invested in industrial or war-oriented chemical products, agriculture was sort of the next target and the next big thing. And glyphosate, actually was a discovery by a scientist in terms of its weed killing abilities, was discovered by a scientist in Monsanto, and he won awards for this discovery of this novel new mode of action, this novel herbicide that could be so safe and kill weeds as so effectively as it does. If anybody's out there has used Roundup or glyphosate, it's remarkable at what it does, which is killing living plant tissue, right? And gets into the roots of the plant and can move through the plant and really not just kill what is above ground, but also what is below ground, which made it so popular. So Monsanto introduced it in 1974. And it's been in use ever since, and is still, as I said before, the world's most widely used weed killer. And there are farmers still who swear by it. There have been problems because it's been used so much now that many types of weeds have become resistant, and so it's not nearly as effective as it used to be. We have overused it, if you want to look at it from that perspective. But it is still used around the world in many countries, and it is still used with these genetically engineered crops that are designed to tolerate it or to be sprayed with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can't remember how much it's been used, but it's definitely the most used herbicide ever. And my understanding is that it's a water soluble molecule. So once it gets into the environment, you can't really get it back. There's no real way to sequester it. It gets into the waterways, it gets into the air, and you kind of just can't really get rid of it. And my understanding is that it doesn't really break down as easily as the Monsanto scientists would tell us that it does. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, early on, that was part of the message from Monsanto that it, breaks down very quickly and doesn't accumulate, but that has really been refuted through a number of scientific studies since then, and it is pretty widely understood now that it has become ubiquitous. And yes, it's our U.S. Geological Survey in the United States, which is part of the Department of Interior of our federal government, has done numerous studies to confirm, as I said earlier, that it's also found in rainfall. It's in the water, it's in surface waters, it's been found in drinking water. It's so common in our environment that even if you don't spray glyphosate yourself or use it, you probably have it in your bodily fluids, in your urine. If you would get that tested, a lot of people have done that. It's a chemical that's become very pervasive in our world.
Yeah, I think you wrote an article maybe last year about how 80% of Americans that were surveyed at one time had glyphosate residue in their urine. This is a real scary thing to think about, that even if we're not directly consuming it, even though we most likely are, it's still in our drinking water. It's still probably in the air to some degree.
Yeah.
Um, so, as far as prevalence and use is concerned, is this a more US based phenomena, or is this, a real worldwide issue?
Well, certainly, it can be seen as a worldwide issue. Glyphosate is used around the world in many different countries. There are a handful that have really tried to ban it or discourage its use. And there's been a huge pushback by not only Monsanto, which is actually now owned by a German company. It was founded and based in the US for over 100 years, but sold in 2018 to German-based Bayer, but still very much has a U.S. footprint and a U.S. presence, and control and influence over U.S. regulators. But when countries do try to ban it, like Mexico is trying to do right now, what we have seen, and I've also written a great deal about this, is the U.S. State Department and regulatory bodies, our USDA, get involved and try to pressure and threaten that country, which is what they're trying to do now with Mexico. And they've done it with Thailand and other countries. But yeah, glyphosate is popularly used in Australia. It's popularly used throughout South America. Europe, many European countries have embraced it. So, it is. I mean, Europe is now looking at re-registration, meaning they are taking up the issue this year about whether or not to keep it on the market throughout the European Union. So that's a battle right now that's going on. And the US has recently said that it is re-registering it as well, that it is letting glyphosate continue to stay on the market because they feel that it's so safe. And they agree with Monsanto and the industry that this is a needed tool that should not be restricted very much. So,
Yeah, I think that's the same point of view that is happening here in Australia. That it's basically an indispensable thing. And if I'm correct, I think glyphosate went off patent in 2007, and it started to be manufactured in China, which, because of Australia's close ties with China, we started to get a lot more glyphosate product in our country since then. But I know that there are a handful of countries that don't use glyphosate-based herbicides. Which countries are those, and what was their reasoning behind saying that we don't believe this is safe for our people?
Right. Gosh, I can't give you a list right now because it's changed so much.
Right.
France said they were going to ban glyphosate. Germany said they were going to ban glyphosate. As I said, Thailand said they were going to ban glyphosate. I don't think any of those countries have actually
Mm,
banned glyphosate. Mexico is trying to ban it right now. I don't know. I mean, they seem to be holding to their guns. I don't know if and they specifically are citing human health concerns. They're trying to ban transgenic corn, GMO corn, and glyphosate. So citing the health of their people and that sort of thing. So
mm.
it's popular in Canada. It's farmers love it, and the industry spends a lot of money and time and energy to make sure that the regulators support it and that the farmer organizations support it. And they basically have tried to put forward the message that, we can't grow food without it, which of course we did before we had glyphosate.
Yeah.
It's a highly profitable endeavor. And of course, it is so closely tied now to genetically altered seeds, which is a huge profit stream for not only Monsanto, Bayer, but a number of other companies as well that have licensed and developed genetic traits that they tie directly to specific pesticides, like 2,4-D and dicamba and glyphosate. So there's a very determined and powerful push by pesticide companies around the world. There's maybe 5 or 6 that are pretty powerful to keep pesticides as a mainstay for food production around the world.
You mentioned earlier about Monsanto being purchased by Bayer several years ago. I think it was for something like $66 billion. I'm not sure if that's the exact amount now, but I've heard some people suggest that that was a bit of a bargain, given that Monsanto really has, the majority of the world's seed and the commodity crops are pretty much under control. Did alarm bells ring for you when you learned that Bayer was buying Monsanto? One of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, getting into chemical agriculture.
Yeah, I mean, well, they were already involved in it to a degree, but my response about the purchase of Monsanto was, are they out of their minds?
Right.
Because at that point, so they closed on the purchase in 2018, but they were discussing it and went public with it a year or maybe a little more than a year in advance. I can't remember the exact, but the announcement of the deal to sell at this price, and I think the ultimate number came out around 63 billion. We'd have to go back and check it. Moved with share prices and things like that. But by that time, the International Agency for Research on Cancer had already declared that glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen. They had already tied it to non-Hodgkin lymphoma. There had already been initial lawsuits filed by people in the US. I could see very clearly, maybe other people couldn't at that point, I could see very clearly that Monsanto was getting out when the getting was good. They knew there was this avalanche of litigation and potential liability coming down on their heads. And they were able, the executives of Monsanto, to collect very big checks and ride off into the sunset and hand this huge liability over to Bayer. And I mean, that's exactly what happened. Bayer closed on the deal, gave Monsanto executives all their money in June of 2018. And in August of 2018, they lost their first trial over this RoundUp litigation. And the stock price of Bayer plunged immediately, wiping out billions of dollars in market capitalization. And they have struggled ever since 2018 to regain that investor confidence. And they've been sued by their investors. The Monsanto purchase has been dubbed like the worst corporate takeover in history by like the Wall Street Journal and different investor groups. They ousted the CEO who orchestrated the Monsanto purchase, and Bayer is currently under pressure from an activist investor group to break up the company and basically sell it off for parts because the litigation over Roundup has been so disruptive and so costly to Bayer. At this point, they've agreed to pay roughly at least $15 billion in settlement and different maneuvers related to the Roundup litigation and Monsanto litigation overall. And they still haven't settled all the litigation in the US. They still have tens of thousands of cases. There's a trial here that starts tomorrow in St. Louis, which was the home base for Monsanto, another Roundup litigation case. And, there's litigation ongoing in Australia. There's litigation in different places around the world. So I don't know, yes, Monsanto was the world's largest seed company. And yes, they had this huge, this weed killer herbicide platform. So from that standpoint, it probably looked like a really good deal. I don't know that any investors right now would say it was a really good deal.
Yeah, definitely. At the time, you could probably see that the writing was on the wall. But I thought when I heard about it that maybe they had some sort of strategy in place, that they knew all this was going to happen and they knew how to deal with it. But $15 billion is quite a lot of money, even for them. And it would suggest to me that if you're paying out in a class action $15 billion damages for the effects of your product, then that product's probably not very safe. Would one be safe to assume that if they have to pay that much in damages, that it's probably a good idea not to use the Roundup?
Well, they say that the settlement money, the money that they're paying out. Now they lost, 3 trials initially and were ordered to pay damages by juries. So that was against their will. And those verdicts were upheld through all appeals courts and that sort of thing. So they had to pay out that money. And then the billions that we're talking about is them voluntarily or through settlement discussions. And they say, that they are not admitting any liability. They still maintain that there's nothing harmful when these products are used as directed, that they don't cause cancer. So that continues to be their position. They did say they were going to remove glyphosate products from the consumer market in the US this year. But so far, we haven't really seen or heard much about that actually happening. So that's something I'm still wondering and waiting about. But they did, even when they said they were doing that, they made the point that it would still be sold to farmers, and professional operators. So their position is very much, it doesn't matter how much they've paid, and it doesn't matter what the scientists say or what the juries say. This is a chemical that is safe, that doesn't cause cancer, is what they say.
And from my understanding, the majority of the litigation that they're facing is primarily around the development of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Are there any other conditions that have been, closely linked, or is the focus primarily on non-Hodgkin's lymphoma?
There have been, the scientific literature has sort of an array of things that it links glyphosate to, and there's different, the weight of evidence would be different for different situations. There's a study that talks about acute myeloid leukemia. More recently, they've been really just kind of alarming findings from some studies that are ongoing in Italy, but they're not, finalized yet, and certainly I don't know that they would be robust enough or replicated to say this is a known kind of condition. But these scientists are saying that they are finding that it affects, that it is an endocrine disruptor, and that it affects the hormone levels and has some very adverse impacts on developing fetuses, babies who might be exposed to it. And they're also seeing sort of a disruption of the really important bacteria in the gut, in the human gut, which could affect the immune system and a whole array of other health impacts. So I think what the scientists would say is we don't know the full extent of the impacts that this chemical could be having on human health, but we know it's commonly found in cereals and crackers and oatmeals and just a whole array of foods because it's so widely used. And we know it's in water, and we know it's in the air as well. Air samples have shown, glyphosate. So a lot of scientists are saying we're just really trying to understand the human health impacts. But back to your point, I think non-Hodgkin lymphoma was selected by the lawyers for litigation because the International Agency for Research on Cancer specifically talked about non-Hodgkin lymphoma and specifically highlighted studies that showed a connection between that specific type of disease. So the lawyers who brought the cases have focused on that rather than just grabbing, because I know a whole lot of people out there are like, well, I have this kind of cancer, or I have that, but they've limited it to non-Hodgkin lymphoma at this point for the litigation.
And what are the primary exposure vectors for the average person, who's consuming these foods that may have come in contact with, Roundup spray during their harvest or their growing?
Well, dermal, I mean, that's what you're asking, sort of the route of exposure, right?
Yeah. So how is the average person exposed to this? How is it getting into their body?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on who you are, right, and what you do. If you're an applicator and you're spraying like from a backpack sprayer, that would be one kind of potential exposure route. If you're a farmer and you're in a cab, and you're spraying, then maybe your route of exposure is more when you're mixing, it, or maybe it's in the air from mist coming, or that sort of thing. If you're a backyard gardener and you spray it and you don't wear protective gloves or shoes or long pants, or maybe dermal exposure, you're probably getting it on your skin where it can soak into your skin and get into your bloodstream. So there have been shown a whole sort of array of different routes. And then if you're eating food with residues of glyphosate in it, you're being exposed that way as well. It's been interesting to follow that, the whole dietary thing, because for so long in the US, our regulators that track residues in food, that track pesticide residues in food, wouldn't test for glyphosate. They just wouldn't do it. They said it wasn't important, or they didn't need to because they knew glyphosate was so safe, and so it didn't matter. But there are legal limits as to what is allowed on food, and they are different in Europe and they're different in the United States. I don't know what the legal limits are in Australia, but the US allows some of the highest levels of glyphosate in food of many other countries. And what you can see going back through regulatory records is that Monsanto repeatedly would go to the EPA and request to let those legal limits, make them higher and higher and higher and higher, because they knew these residues were getting into our foods. And the EPA, you see them saying yes over and over and just raising what that legal limit is for glyphosate. So we're now seeing, we've started to see, they've done some very limited surveys, our federal government has, to track glyphosate residues in foods, and have found it, of course, but they still say it's not a problem because it's within these legal limits. Although I have some internal, I've written about these, I think, in my books. I have some internal documents that they didn't release publicly, but that I was able to get my hands on, that talk about glyphosate levels that should be illegal, that would be illegal in Europe or other places that are so high. So
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty crazy. I think I remember after some of the first surveys were done, and then yeah, I think they doubled or tripled the level that was acceptable, and all of a sudden it looked like, oh, it's all fine. There's hardly any in there. Um, so I mean, it just speaks to the influence that they have on the policymakers. I guess money really talks, and that's something that you go into in quite a bit of depth in your books.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the food thing really resonated with me, I guess, because I'm not a farmer, I'm not a school groundskeeper. I don't spray Roundup for a living, but I do feed my kids cereal, and oatmeal and vegetables and fruits and bread and things like that. And so knowing that these companies, that Monsanto went to the EPA and said, we want to be able to have more and more and more of that in the food. And the EPA saying, sure, that's fine. What is the point of having these levels? And then seeing, like, for instance, one of the emails from the Food and Drug Administration inside, I remember, I'll have to paraphrase, but they were bringing food products in to test. One chemist was writing an email to another chemist at the FDA and said, I'm bringing food in from my house to just test it for glyphosate. They were doing some preliminary tests. And he said, it's in everything. He said he found it in crackers and cereal and in granolas. He found it in everything. He said the only thing he couldn't find glyphosate in at that time was broccoli. And that just always has stuck with me. Now, of course, they didn't publicize that. That was something that I had to obtain myself. But, you know, so I guess we all should eat broccoli if we were worried about glyphosate. I don't know.
So, you mentioned GMO foods before, which have been specifically engineered. The vast majority of GMOs are specifically engineered so that they can be directly sprayed with Roundup and they don't die, unlike any other plant that would obviously die quickly. Um, so, I suspect that those foods are going to be the ones that are the most laden with glyphosate residue. Um, but I'm also aware that there's a practice of, even though that wheat is not genetically modified at the moment, that it is sprayed at the end of its growing period as a desiccant to help the harvest, to make the harvest easier, to dry the wheat out. Is this a practice that's common across the world, do you know, or is this, something that's just happening in America?
Definitely not just in America. And I don't know about Australia. I believe they do use it in Australia as a desiccant, but I could be wrong. I know in Canada, it's been popular as a desiccant in more northern regions of the United States. The way farmers explained it to me was a desiccant could be really useful if you have sort of an uneven, weather, temperature, moisture situation at the end of your growing season. And so different fields might be maturing at different levels, or you want everything to even out and to dry out quickly. And so they use it not only on wheat but lentils and oats is a crop that has where you've seen a lot of use of glyphosate, which I remember some reports a few years ago, tests that were run on baby food because oatmeal is used often, to make baby food. And, all of the different baby foods were found to have all these glyphosate residues in it, which, again, is very worrisome if you're a mother or a parent, at least
Mm.
would be for me.
Yeah,
So,
definitely. I know there was one survey that found the highest levels of residue in Canadian legumes, chickpeas and lentils and whatnot. Um, so from your perspective, it's probably, I assume you would think it's best to eat those types of foods organic and do your best to avoid that exposure vector.
yeah, I mean, I think, hummus, right? I love
Yeah.
hummus, made with chickpeas, but I try to only buy organic hummus. I think it's a personal decision. I think everybody, has their relative risk, at one place or another, but it's informed by a lot of different things that are all very personal and individualized. So, but for me, yeah, I mean, I try to feed my kids organic fruits and vegetables and foods because I want to lower the contaminant burden if I can. I want to lower the pesticide burden. It's not only glyphosate residues. I mean, these Food and Drug Administration reports and USDA reports that we have here in the United States track, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different types of pesticides in food. And the reports that they put out, are very thick and very detailed. And so you find a whole array of insecticides and herbicides and fungicides on apples and lettuce and spinach and, virtually everything that you would expect to put down on your dinner plate. You're going to have some level, if it was conventionally grown, you're going to be consuming pesticides, with your lunch or your dinner.
So, what were some of the most alarming or surprising documents that you found in researching your books? I know you got your hands on a lot of internal emails, lots of stuff through the Freedom of Information Act that they obviously didn't want anyone to know about. What were some standouts for you that really showed that there was a bit of corruption going on?
Well, yeah, for the corruption part, I mean, the emails about residues in foods like really struck me as well. Like one FDA chemist found all this glyphosate in honey, even organic honey, that he had gone out to stores around the region and purchased all of these different samples of honey and brought it back to the FDA and tested and found it in all this organic honey and told his bosses about it and told them that they should report it. And the bosses basically told him, not to worry about it. And they weren't going to do anything about it. And they didn't. But, really shocking stuff. I guess that two things come to mind. One is when a different agency in the United States that was part of our Health and Human Services, part of Centers for Disease Control, that we refer to as the ATSDR, Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. But they said in 2015 that they wanted to do a review of glyphosate for toxicity. And this is when IARC, the International Cancer Group, was also looking at it and had said that it was a probable human carcinogen. And you see through these emails and text messages that Monsanto went to the very head of the EPA Office of Pesticide Programs. This is our chief regulatory body, and went to them very directly, this individual, and said, we want that review. We don't think that ATSDR should do its review of glyphosate. Like, we don't want that to happen, and it shouldn't happen. It's going to be duplicative and just a waste of resources for the government, and is there anything you can do about that, EPA? And you see the top EPA guy go to his second in command within like an hour of receiving this email. He basically hopped right to it and set in motion to do exactly what Monsanto wanted and kill off this ATSDR review. And then you see another EPA official in other emails writing to Monsanto saying, if I can kill this, I should get a medal. And he actually did kill it. And then you see them ghostwriting a scientific study. You see all of these emails where they spent 3 years working on this scientific study that was going to proclaim glyphosate to be so very safe. This was in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And they talk about we're going to give this to regulators around the world, and everybody will see how safe it is. But we don't want anybody to know that we're doing it, that we're spending 3 years on this. We want it to look completely independent. And so all of this and all of these, the work and the editing and the rewriting and this and that, but they don't have any Monsanto employees' names on it at all because it has to look independent. And they celebrate when it's all done They have a big celebration and they get everybody like commemorative shirts because they all did such a great job on this ghostwritten study. So that to me was shocking because it's just like arrogance and the depths of deception that this company would engage in. And there's many more examples of the ghostwriting. But, if it was truly a really, really safe chemical, why would you have to do that? Why would you have to deceive and ghostwrite scientific studies and pretend that independent scientists were saying it was safe when really you were the one saying it was safe? The deception is something that I think you cannot argue over because it's laid out so blatantly in the internal documents.
Yeah, I think that's what I found most fascinating reading Whitewash was how orchestrated everything was. There were deliberate attempts to. I know in in the in Whitewash you speak about Peter Infante, who was heavily involved in the IARC's decision to name glyphosate a probable human carcinogen, and basically the emails showing we need to get rid of him because he favors independent research rather than industry funded research, and we just can't have that. And he was ousted, and they didn't even tell him. He was still getting the emails. But they take this very, very seriously in making sure that the everything falls in their favor with regards to safety. So how would you go about, obviously there are a lot of people out there who hear this and think, oh, well, that can't be right, because if it was truly unsafe, the government would protect us from it. It just can't be right. And you wind up looking like a conspiracy theorist very, very quickly when you suggest that perhaps Monsanto have been a little disingenuous. How would you normally go about going through a conversation like that?
I guess I don't even really have the energy anymore to do that because I feel like there's so much evidence out there. And, my both of my books, my first one, Whitewash, is so heavily, everything we documented, every single sentence pretty much, and you can go and we have links, and I put the Monsanto internal documents up on a website. They've been sent to UCSF Documents Library. They're available in many different places. So people can look at the documents themselves and they can see. They don't have to believe me or take my word for it. You can see the company themselves they use the word ghostwriting. They talked about the creation of scientific studies that looked like they were independent. Now, that's deception. There's an email, there's so many, but there's another one that always resonated with me because he said it so clearly. It was a guy named Jim Vicini, Vicini, Vicini in Monsanto. And this was on GMO crops, not on glyphosate, but he was trying to write a paper about how, great GMO crops were, but he wanted some independent scientist's name on it instead of his, because he works for Monsanto. And he says in this email, it's pretty hard for me to find somebody, to put their name on it when they didn't actually write it. Like it's hard for me to find somebody who's willing to put their name on something they didn't write. But it certainly gives us more credibility, if it looks independent. They created all these different front groups that they're secretly paying. We found money trails to groups that they help fund, like Genetic Literacy Project and American Council on Science and Health, that they pay to, again, look like they're independent voices. You wouldn't need to do that if your product was really safe, right?
Yeah.
Would you?
Mm.
I don't know.
So in writing these books, you've pretty much been going after, multi-billion-dollar companies. Have you ever felt like you might have a target on your back? Have you been the target of any sort of attack?
Not physical attack, thank God, but certainly reputationally, yes. I mean, these front groups, as I said, these front groups, that we know that they funded, that we have documentation that they funded, have written dozens and dozens and dozens of articles about, what a terrible person I am, what a corrupt person I am, what a liar I am, all sorts of things like that. They've targeted other journalists as well, other scientists, anybody who has brought forward information that is not favorable to Monsanto. They come back at you. But again, they don't really want it to look like it's coming from Monsanto. They want it to look like it's coming from an independent third party. For my book, Whitewash, they had a whole strategic plan that they developed in a spreadsheet that they put together with the Carey Gillam book project. I think I'd have to go look it back up what they headlined their spreadsheet, but and it assigned duties to all these different people as to how to try to discredit me, discredit the book, engage third parties, bring in a consulting firm, get negative reviews posted on Amazon that look like they're coming from regular people and not from Monsanto. It's a machine. It's a giant machine. And it's not just Monsanto. I'm working on some stuff now involving Paraquat and a company called Syngenta. And I don't know if what I'm seeing there is worse or better. It's definitely just as bad. I mean, the deceit, the deception, the things that they knew to be true about the health impacts of their product, and you compare that to what they were saying on their websites or in their public notices, and it's completely different. And they were hiding. There's literally just document after document where this company is hiding its own scientists' work that was finding harmful impacts of their own product. And they hide that from the EPA and outwardly lie to the EPA about what their scientists are finding. So, I don't know what to say, but there's a lot of evidence that the chemical companies are not being forthcoming about the dangers of their products.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most upsetting thing, is that they've probably known for decades. I know, speaking to Stephanie Seneff, her work with Anthony Samsel, they've been looking through all of the old, studies from Monsanto in the 1980s that they never published. And it seems like they knew all of these problems were happening back in the 80s. They knew that glyphosate wasn't breaking down. They knew that it was being stuck in the body, and they just never published it. And it's only through, a few people that have really pursued these old documents through the Freedoms of Information Act that they've got their hands on these. It's really upsetting that despite the fact that they know all of these problems are going on, they've continued.
Oh, yeah. Some of the best, for Whitewash, some of the best documents that I got were from the EPA and was from this really old archive that went back to when the EPA started, basically in the 1970s. And you could track communications and that very early foundational study that Monsanto gave the EPA that I call the 1985 mouse study, but that's not, what it was called. But, that was the pivotal study, because they gave it to the EPA. The EPA scientists looked at it and said, this causes rare tumors, in the animals. This looks like this could be oncogenic or could be a cancer-causing substance. And Monsanto fights them and comes back and says, no, you or your scientists are evaluating this incorrectly. Let us tell you how you should evaluate it. And this goes on for years, and they hire this other guy, and he comes in and he tells the EPA he's found this other tumor in the control group. And so it changes the statistical significance, and they bring in a scientific advisory panel, and they tell Monsanto to redo the study. And Monsanto says, heck no, we're not going to redo the study. I mean, it goes on. And eventually the EPA just caves to Monsanto and says, okay, you don't have to redo the study. and we're going to agree with you. We're going to override our own scientists and agree with you and say it doesn't look like it causes cancer. And on that final document in the early 1990s, that set the stage for where we are today, because the EPA is taking the exact same position today. And it's noteworthy that when that final report was signed, several EPA scientists refused to sign it, refused to put their names on it, because they felt that it was so wrong. And, still to this day, we just had a federal court last summer tell the EPA that they were evaluating glyphosate incorrectly, that they were not following their own rules in looking at the science about cancer causation, and ordering the EPA to follow its rules and properly evaluate the science. So it's definitely not. The one thing I've learned over all of these decades of work here is that it is not true that our regulators are there to protect us. And they are in name, I think. But what I've seen over and over and over again is that corporate protection comes over public protection.
Yeah, it's disappointing, but it's kind of just the way things are at the moment. My grandparents were grain farmers, and I remember my mum telling me about when they first started spraying, and it was just this miracle. They could grow bigger crops. They were getting bigger yields. I think she tells this story about one year, every farmer in the town, was new to the sprays, and they got the biggest crop they'd ever got, and their local Ford dealer sold the most cars of any dealership in the whole state, because everyone went out and bought a car that year after their harvest. So they really thought, and these aren't bad people. They really thought this was the best thing, because they were no longer, hoping and praying that their crops were going to be all right. They had a little bit more safety, and they could be a little bit more, it was a bit more reliable, and they didn't have to struggle financially as much as they used to. But after years of use, it gets a little bit more difficult. And of course, it's extremely difficult to stop using after you've been using it for a while. And I think that's something that I'm really interested in, is how do you get away from this system that we're using at the moment? How do we get back to using more organic, more regenerative, no-till systems? I mean, you've been working with the farmers. What do you see is the way out of this current system that we're using?
I think, you're right. It's the farmers, when they start to back away from this or be concerned, it's because they're seeing it's not as effective for them anymore, right? And they're also understanding or seeing the evidence of the environmental impacts, the impacts on pollinators, biodiversity, the health of the soil, the sterility of the soil that you're causing when you use this chemical over and over and over and over again. And so what I've seen in the United States and and to farmers I've talked to in some other countries is that they really are they've decided that the benefit is no longer outweighing the cost, or they see that the benefit is not going to be outweighing the cost in the near future, right? They're looking at the long term, and they're deciding that they're going to just bite the bullet and do it. And you're right, it's not easy at all. But, there are groups of farmers here in the US that are banding together and sharing ideas and techniques and, trying to deploy more of these traditional techniques, rotating crops, which is not novel, very certainly, but having a really aggressive and very strategic crop rotation and cover crops and other sorts of strategies that they're finding, or they say, if you do it in a really focused way and a data-oriented way, which is what they're trying to do. They're measuring everything down to, what's our row spacing, and when are we planting this cover crop, and what are we, and what is our rotation to get the most nutrition back in the soil, right? And have the most, the best insect protection or the best weed protection without using chemicals. And they're collecting data points and letting the data guide them on that. And it's very exciting to watch how that's coming together. And of course, there are people lobbying for more government subsidies and support for farmers who are going this route, because in the US, the primary support of government, taxpayer funded support is for farmers using chemicals. It's for these conventional types of practices that really we know are harming the environment as well as human health. So I think it's a whole, it's consumers need to decide what they care about when they buy their food. People need to tell their elected lawmakers and representatives, where they should be directing taxpayer dollars, and farmers need to think more about the long term as opposed to just the next harvest. Right?
Yeah,
See where I get this. I
I
don't
think
know.
I think grassroots, like Zen Honeycutt says, it starts with mothers. Mothers have the power to really change all of this. Only when the mothers say yes can things really happen. And hopefully that's, I've seen really great work with Farmers Footprint as well, in the States and here. It seems like the organic movement is happening. It's more people are buying organic. More farmers are realizing that there's a demand and they can actually profit from an organic agriculture system. Hopefully we see more regenerative as well. That's what I'd really like to see. I guess before I let you go, I wanted to know, you're an investigative journalist. I mean, your whole career has been centered around finding the truth and, not letting anything get in the way of that. How have you perceived, the events of the last few years from your lens as an investigative journalist, and, all of this stuff around, fake news and, it's trying to navigate the media space with, one journalist says one thing, one journalist says, something completely different. This must hit a little bit differently for you because this is sort of, this is your career, this is your profession.
Yeah.
So how have you seen the events of the last few years?
Yeah. I mean, I find it deeply troubling that I don't feel that I can trust, or I have a different lens now looking at trusted media sources, I guess. And I feel so sorry for all of us that, we're losing, I think, an easy way to discern what is true and what is not true, right? Or maybe not even easy, but you're right. I mean, there's so many different forces out there that are now trying to be information providers to consumers and others, and they're driven by forces that are not the traditional journalistic endeavor that I, was trained in and grew up in and have tried to hold my whole career, which is, you follow the facts, and the facts are what the facts are, and you lay them out and you give people the documentation if you can't, you lay out the facts, and then the dust settles however it settles. And but there's so much now that is, you're right. I mean, it's fake news, it's misinformation, and it's coming not only from weird random places on the internet, but from, high level government agencies or regulatory bodies, or, it's pervasive, and it's all seems to be because we've become so divided and so partisan, and it's about power and money and who's going to have the power and who's going to have the money and who's going to have the influence. And it just makes my head hurt and it makes me sad. And so I don't have any good answer for you, I guess. Except I just feel like if I can keep trying to do what I do and be factual about things, and hopefully others can do the same. I mean, people, attacked me before Whitewash came out. So many, when it was coming out, or, at Reuters, the industry really tried to discredit me, and people were doubting me. And when Whitewash came out, I had a lot of reporters and other people say, yeah, but is this really true? Like, how do we know this is really true? I'm like, look at all the documents that go with this book. Look at all of the reference materials. And then as more started happening, and then as the first RoundUp trials started happening, and then all of these internal documents, more and more of them came to light, then all these people were like, oh, wow, like everything you've been saying was true. How does that make you feel? Like, well, I always knew it was true. So, but it took people a while to catch up. So I guess I do have that hope that, eventually truth wins out. Eventually enough light is shined down upon events that we know the truth, but it shouldn't take years and years. So
I'm an optimist too. I really think we'll get there. I just hope it doesn't take very long. So what are you working on at the moment, and what's the future look like for you?
Well, at the moment, I'm working on more oh, you can't see it. There it is. More documents on this. These are on Paraquat, internal corporate documents, to try to write another installment, writing for The Guardian. Also, I have a news outlet called The New Lead. Please encourage people to go look at The New Lead. LEDE is the way we spell it. It's a journalistic term, but The New Lead .org, nonprofit little news outlet associated with Environmental Working Group. And so writing there and trying to just keep finding stuff that is useful to our knowledge about human health and environmental health, and talking to people like you. So
I'll make sure I put links to everything that you're involved in. Okay. And also, you were involved in the documentary that's coming out soon, Into the Weeds. Can you tell us how were you involved in that, and when is that coming out?
Yeah, gosh, and I don't know screening in Australia. We've done screenings in Canada. We've done some in the US. We just were in Europe, where we screened it in Brussels and talked to the European Parliament about it. My official title, I guess, or in the credits of it, I'm called story consultant for Into the Weeds, but it's put together by an award-winning documentary filmmaker in Canada, Jennifer Backwall. And it's remarkable. She took my two books. She bought the rights to Whitewash and the Monsanto papers, and had me sort of introduce her to Lee Johnson, who was the very first plaintiff in the RoundUp trial, and take her, through my reporting. And then she's done a lot, of her own, obviously, investigative work, and just created this really, really remarkably beautiful and powerful film about my book, The Monsanto Papers, about Lee Johnson's story of his fight against cancer and his fight against Monsanto. And then the bigger implications of what I wrote in Whitewash about the impacts on, the environment and biodiversity and pollinators and that sort of thing. So it's a great film. And yeah, it's supposed to be, I think we've got a deal for it to be streaming, and it's going to be on some big screens across the US. But I'm not familiar with where it's going to be in Australia and when.
We'll figure it out. I'll make sure I get a link to it in the description, and I'll make sure I'm going to watch it myself as well. I won't keep you any longer, because I know you're probably very busy, a lot busier than me, that's for sure. I can't thank you enough for taking some time to speak with me. I really hope more people get introduced to your work and start to take this a little more seriously. I think the word is catching on, and books like yours are really leading the way, I think, in really giving it a solid foundation and taking it out of that conspiracy theory area and really giving it a solid foundation to stand on. So thank you so much for all the work that you've done, and I can't wait to see what you keep writing.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you for the work that you do to illuminate this sort of stuff. I really appreciate that. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this one. If you'd like to support Carey's work, I've left links to her various platforms in the description. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can subscribe on Spotify and YouTube, and you can leave up to a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. This is a simple, no-cost way to support my work and help me reach more listeners. Please feel free to leave comments on my YouTube channel, as I do try to read through as many as I can. I've also put links to all my social media platforms in the episode notes if you'd like updates about the podcast, information about health, or if you'd just like to reach out to me. Thanks again, everyone. Take care.